Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we cut through the noise to get you truly well informed. For years now, the war in Ukraine has dominated headlines, focusing on the shifting front lines and military aid. But today, we're taking a vital pivot. We're looking at a less discussed yet absolutely critical dimension of this conflict, the incredibly intricate and often frustrating journey of peace negotiations.
That's right.
Our mission today is to go beyond those battlefield reports. We've sifted through a stack of sources, articles, research, diplomatic communiques to, extract the most important insights into the various attempts at peace talks since Russia's full-scale invasion back in February 2022. We want to uncover the aha moments that truly explain why peace has remained so stubbornly out of reach.
And it is indeed a story layered with complexity. On one hand, you have these constant public calls for peace, echoing from international bodies and citizens alike. But then on the other hand, the stark reality is this collision of deeply entrenched, often maximalist demands from both Russia and Ukraine. This deep dive will really help you understand the fundamental why behind all these stops and starts, illuminating why a resolution remains so elusive, even amidst widespread calls for an end to the fighting.
Okay, so to begin, let's unpack the initial attempts at dialogue. Many of you will recall the swiftness of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. But what were Russia and Ukraine actually asking for right out of the gate? What were those initial, often non-negotiable demands that immediately shaped the diplomatic landscape?
Well, from Russia's perspective, their starting demands were quite extensive, really ambitious. They sought recognition of all occupied land as Russian, including claims on regions not fully under their control even then. Crucially, they demanded guarantees that Ukraine would never join NATO, a significant curtailment of Ukraine's military capabilities, and, of course, the lifting of all sanctions against Russia.
And Ukraine's conditions were equally firm from the very beginning, setting a clear counter-narrative, weren't they?
Absolutely. Ukraine's clear conditions centered on a full withdrawal of Russian troops from all its territories, the return of all prisoners of war and kidnapped Ukrainian children, also the prosecution of Russian leaders for war crimes, and robust, internationally backed security guarantees to prevent any future aggression. These weren't minor points, they were, foundational to Ukraine's sovereignty. In those very first formal meetings, like the ones held in Belarus and later in Antalya, the initial agreement was for talks without preconditions. There was even that moment where Belarusian President Lukashenko reportedly assured Ukraine that military activity from Belarusian territory would cease during these negotiations. Yet, despite these superficial agreements to talk, the outcome was consistently described as no breakthrough.
No breakthrough.
Yeah, this early failure immediately underscored the sheer chasm between their core demands. It revealed just how far apart the two sides truly were from the very first handshake.
Then came what seemed like a truly surprising development with the Istanbul peace talks in March 2022. For a brief period, it genuinely seemed like there was some tangible movement there. Reports indicated Ukraine was reportedly willing to give up its NATO aspirations and even consider making Russian a second official language. That sounded like a significant potential concession.
It certainly presented the appearance of progress, yeah. However, those early Istanbul talks ultimately failed for a whole confluence of reasons, which, as Stephen Sharap and Jeremy Rodchenko, two prominent experts, have argued, reveal a lot about the true intent. Firstly, there was a critical failure to prioritize a ceasefire, so fighting continued even as negotiations took place.
Okay.
Secondly, fundamental disagreements persisted on Ukraine's long-term military status and security architecture. Western nations were also reluctant, really, to provide the absolute security guarantees Ukraine sought, and crucially, the growing awareness of Russian atrocities against civilians, particularly the revelations from Bucha, severely eroded any remaining trust.
Right. Bucha changed things.
It really did. And Ukraine's increased confidence following Russian retreats from northern Kyiv also stiffened its resolve. It's also important to note that these discussions didn't even address the return of Russian-occupied territory, which quickly became an immovable obstacle. Looking back, some observers saw Russia's engagement in these talks as maybe a tactical diversion, designed to buy time for regrouping rather than a genuine pursuit of peace.
And a particularly astonishing fact later surfaced regarding those initial weeks. Dmitry Kozak, a key Putin envoy, reportedly struck a provisional deal for Ukraine to stay out of NATO soon after the invasion began. But Putin himself apparently rejected it, preferring a full-scale military invasion and the outright annexing of swathes of Ukrainian territory. Now, a Kremlin spokesman later denied this report, but its emergence does raise profound questions.
Oh, absolutely. This detail, if true, is incredibly revealing about the underlying motivations guiding the conflict. If such a significant concession was on the table and rejected by the Russian leadership, well, it forces you to ask. Was the negotiation process ever truly a genuine pathway to peace in those early days? Or was it, as some suggest, more of a strategic smokescreen designed to mask broader, more maximalist objectives, which in this case included outright territorial conquest? This particular anecdote, yeah, it casts a long shadow over the sincerity of early diplomatic efforts.
So, as the conflict progressed and the battlefield shifted, so too did the fundamental calculus for both sides. This ushered in a new, more complex phase of diplomatic efforts, often involving outside players. After Ukrainian offensives and Russia's annexations of 4 Ukrainian oblasts in September 2022, despite not even fully controlling all of them, President Zelensky declared negotiations with Putin impossible, and Ukraine formally applied for NATO membership. How directly did those military realities impact the diplomatic one?
Profoundly. I mean, what we see here is a direct correlation. Military gains and losses on the ground consistently and profoundly reshaped diplomatic positions. After Ukraine's successful counteroffensives in Kherson and Kharkiv, Zelensky's stance understandably hardened. This period also saw a flurry of international attempts at mediation, reflecting a global desire to intervene somehow. Mexico, for instance, proposed a peace plan in September 2022, but Ukraine swiftly rejected it.
Right.
Elon Musk's proposal, which included ceding Crimea, foregoing NATO membership, and holding UN-supervised referendums, was welcomed by Russia but strongly rebuffed by Ukraine as being pro-Russia.
Yeah, I remember that one.
Then, in February 2023, China stepped forward with its own 12-point plan. This called for a ceasefire, dialogue, security guarantees for Russia, and territorial integrity. Western responses were mixed, often, tinged with skepticism regarding China's geopolitical motivations, and Ukraine's condition remained unyielding, Russian withdrawal from all occupied territories. Later, in June 2023, a delegation of African leaders met with Putin to present their peace initiative. However, Putin rejected this plan, explicitly citing the ongoing Ukrainian counteroffensive as a reason for not agreeing to a ceasefire at that time.
And even as all these external proposals were happening, Putin continued to send signals, reportedly open to a ceasefire that would freeze fighting along the current lines. But U.S. President Biden quite firmly rejected any such proposals without Ukraine's direct participation.
And this highlights a crucial point about agency and legitimacy in these proposals. By June 2024, Putin outlined his own terms, which Zelensky sharply compared to Hitler's ultimatums. These demands were indeed maximalist, a complete handover of all annexed provinces, including parts not even under Russian control. Ukraine becoming a neutral country, abandoning NATO and nuclear weapons, respecting Russian speakers, lifting sanctions, and accepting demilitarization and denazification. These terms, of course, are profoundly contentious. That denazification term in particular is widely seen by Ukraine and its allies as a baseless pretext for invasion, making these demands a significant and, deeply problematic obstacle to any legitimate dialogue.
In direct contrast to Putin's terms, we saw the June 2024 Ukraine Peace Summit in Switzerland. This was a significant international effort, bringing together representatives from 92 nations and 8 international organizations, notably without Russia's participation. The joint communique they endorsed focused on critical humanitarian and safety issues, nuclear safety, food security, and the return of prisoners and deported children. While that summit clearly highlights international efforts, what specifically does the absence of Russian participation tell us about the current state of global diplomacy on this issue? Well, it tells us that while the international community is actively seeking a path to peace and focusing on shared humanitarian principles, the direct bilateral channel between the key belligerents is largely frozen. The summit became a platform for building a consensus among Ukraine's allies and neutral nations, articulating principles for peace, but, without Russia at the table, it couldn't directly advance a ceasefire or a political settlement. It underscored a global desire for resolution, but also the enduring chasm with Moscow. Okay, let's fast forward a bit to 2025, where the pace of diplomatic efforts seemed to pick up significantly, often with a new major player in the mix: former U.S. President Trump. This period brought a distinct shift in dynamics, didn't it?
It absolutely did. The potential for a change in U.S. leadership immediately altered the diplomatic landscape. In February 2025, a U.S.-Russia summit took place in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, attended by figures like Marco Rubio alongside Witkoff and Michael Waltz for the U.S., while Russia was represented by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and presidential aide Yuri Ushakov. They reportedly agreed to restore embassy staffing and explore potential economic opportunities post-settlement. However, the summit was deeply controversial. Lavrov, for instance, rejected any NATO peacekeeping force, explicitly stating that NATO expansion remained a direct threat to Russia.
Wow.
More critically, Ukraine was excluded from these talks, leading to Trump's stated disappointment in Ukraine's reaction, even as European leaders expressed significant alarm over their exclusion.
A particularly contentious moment then arose with the proposed U.S.-Ukraine minerals deal in February 2025. What was this all about, and why did it create such a stir, especially at such a sensitive time?
Oh, this was a genuine flashpoint. It really revealed the immense pressure Ukraine was under. The U.S. reportedly pitched for 50% of Ukraine's rare earth minerals, a massive economic stake. What's crucial here is that this proposal apparently came with no explicit security guarantees for Ukraine. Zelensky's reaction was swift and strong. He called it a debacle and emphatically resisted the notion that Ukraine was for sale. This was quickly followed by sharp criticism from Trump, who reportedly called Zelensky a dictator and subsequently ordered the suspension of U.S. military and intelligence aid to Ukraine. This entanglement of vital military support with high-stakes economic demands and harsh political rhetoric highlighted a deeply vulnerable position for Ukraine.
We also saw a couple of short-lived ceasefire proposals around this time, both marked by a significant ambiguity. First, the U.S. proposed 30-day total ceasefire in March 2025. Ukraine agreed to it, but Russia effectively rejected it, citing issues which needed to be solved. Then, after a Trump-Putin call, Russia agreed to an energy infrastructure strike moratorium for 1 month, though its exact terms remained unclear. How should we interpret such ambiguous outcomes?
That certainly paints a clear picture of murkiness, doesn't it? These ambiguous outcomes are telling. They suggest a willingness to engage in talks about ceasefires, perhaps for political optics or to test the waters, but not a readiness to commit to the specific, verifiable terms required for a genuine cessation of hostilities. The conflicting statements from Ukraine and Russia on the precise terms and start date of the energy infrastructure moratorium, for example, just underscore a profound lack of trust and clear communication, making any such proposal difficult to implement and sustain. Then, in April 2025, what was described as a U.S. ultimate peace proposal emerged, and this was nothing short of a geopolitical earthquake. It included Crimea being formally recognized as Russian territory, the conflict frozen with Russia holding de facto control of its seized areas, Ukraine exiting NATO but joining the EU, U.S. sanctions on Russia revoked, and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant operated by the U.S. for both nations. This proposal represents a significant departure from previous international positions, especially regarding territorial integrity and sanctions. It fundamentally altered the paradigm of what a peace deal could look like.
That truly is a dramatic shift in approach. And finally, bring us to the August 2025 Alaska summit between Trump and Putin. What was the expectation there, especially regarding Ukraine's attendance and the potential outcomes given the prior developments?
Well, the Alaska summit was a highly anticipated event, precisely because of the shifts we'd just discussed. A crucial detail here is that Zelensky was reportedly not invited. This emphasized the bilateral nature Trump seemed to be pursuing with Russia, effectively sidelining Ukraine in talks about its own future. Reports suggested Trump was said to back the ceding of Ukrainian territory to Russia as part of a peace deal. The expectation was for a significant, potentially unilateral shift in the conflict's trajectory, highlighting the immense influence of external actors on the peace process, possibly at Ukraine's direct expense.
Given this dizzying array of proposals and the dramatic shifts we've seen, particularly with the U.S. in 2025, it begs the question, what are the consistent, immovable core sticking points that continue to derail any prospect of direct negotiations between Ukraine and Russia?
Broadly speaking, direct negotiations remain incredibly challenging because the core demands are just so far apart. And in some cases, they've become even more maximalist over time. If we look across the various proposals from the Istanbul Communiqué in 2022 to Ukraine's own peace formula, the Brazilian-Chinese six-point plan, the Bergenstock Communiqué, and that recent U.S. peace plan, certain key negotiation points consistently emerge as intractable.
Like what specifically?
Well, issues like nuclear safety, particularly for the Zaporizhzhia NPP, food security, and the return of prisoners of war, civilian detainees, and child deportees, these are common threads across many plans. They're often presented as humanitarian imperatives. However, the stark differences arise on the most critical political issues. The legal status of the Russia-Ukraine border demands for Russian withdrawal versus a ceasefire that isn't seen as legitimizing occupation, accountability for war crimes. And crucially, security guarantees for Ukraine and its potential NATO membership. For instance, the early Istanbul talks and the U.S. peace plan suggested Ukraine's neutrality and non-NATO status. It's a red line for Ukraine.
Right.
While Ukraine's peace formula emphasizes full security guarantees and eventual NATO membership, the U.S. plan also controversially proposed formal recognition of Crimea as Russian and freezing the conflict along current lines, which is just a non-starter for Kyiv. These deeply conflicting positions reveal why genuine resolution is so difficult.
Given those deep divisions on critical points, why is finding a truly credible third party to mediate proven so challenging throughout all these attempts? What characteristics does such a mediator even need?
Yeah, this brings up a vital point. A truly credible mediator needs to be demonstrably impartial, seen as fair by all sides, and capable of garnering broad support. But many international bodies and nations face inherent hurdles. The UN, OSCE, and EU, despite their experience and reach, are often perceived as aligned with Ukraine and its Western partners. That makes Russia unlikely to accept them as neutral. The Normandy format, previously instrumental, is now limited by current dynamics. The United States, while possessing significant diplomatic power, provides extensive military support to Ukraine, making Russia fundamentally unlikely to accept it as impartial, certainly from Moscow's perspective.
And China.
Similarly, China, despite its considerable diplomatic influence, faces Western skepticism due to its geopolitical motivations and its perceived bias. Ukraine's defense minister, Alexei Reznikov, specifically mentioned this, stating Ukraine would only accept China as a mediator if it convinced Russia to withdraw. So yeah, finding that universally trusted mediator is tough.
And as Project Plowshares identifies, there are some core dilemmas here too. The fear that negotiations legitimize current battle lines, the difficulty in balancing a ceasefire with substantive peace talks, and the necessity of addressing the security assurances sought by both Ukraine, territorial integrity, sovereignty, and Russia. No NATO expansion, no foreign military near borders.
Exactly. The core of the challenge is that for Ukraine, accepting a ceasefire without a clear path to regaining territorial integrity is seen as legitimizing an illegal occupation. It's just not acceptable. For Russia, security assurances mean preventing what it perceives as existential threats, particularly NATO expansion and military buildup on its borders. These are fundamentally opposing security paradigms, deeply rooted in historical grievances and current geopolitical realities. Finding a credible third party who can navigate such profound, often non-negotiable concerns without appearing to favor one side is an immense, perhaps even impossible task in the current climate.
Beyond the diplomats and leaders, what do the people directly affected think about peace? What patterns or surprises stand out to you in these opinion polls we've seen?
The public opinion data is indeed quite revealing, and it shifted considerably over time. In Ukraine, back in 2022, there was initially very strong opposition to territorial concessions. Something like 82%, 87% opposed them, even if it meant prolonging the war. 70% wanted to fight for victory. By February 2024, a growing number, 72%, supported seeking both diplomatic and military solutions. That indicates an openness to negotiation, but not at any cost. And by 2025, support for a negotiated end increased to 69%, becoming the majority opinion.
Okay, so a shift towards negotiation.
Yes, but, and this is crucial, despite this openness, there's still very strong opposition to freezing conflict lines, 65% against, ceding NATO membership, 60% against, or accepting military limits, a massive 83% against. Critically, 86% of Ukrainians still believe Russia would attack again even if a peace treaty were signed. This reveals a deep-seated distrust that any peace deal would actually be lasting.
And what about public sentiment in Russia during this period?
In Russia, Levada Center's survey in October 2022 showed 57% favored peace talks. Kremlin analysis at the time suggested public support for the war was broad but not deep, with most willing to accept anything Putin called a victory, rather than actively advocating for specific military outcomes. By September 2023, the head of the VTSEM state pollster claimed only 10–15% of Russians actively supported the war, indicating that the majority were not demanding the conquest of Kyiv or Odessa. These figures suggest a more nuanced public sentiment than often portrayed. A desire for an end to conflict, perhaps, but less conviction in the specifics of a military victory, and a high degree of deference to the state's narrative.
And internationally.
Among other nations, a January 2023 German poll found over 80% believed ending the war through negotiations was more important than a Ukrainian victory, highlighting varied international perspectives on the ultimate goal.
To truly grasp why these demands are so seemingly unmovable, we have to acknowledge they're not just about the events of 2022, are they? They're echoes of a much longer, often deeply painful history between Russia and Ukraine. We're talking about a legacy that includes the Russian Empire's Little Russia concept, Russification efforts, the devastating Holodomor famine, and post-Soviet disputes over Crimea and the Black Sea Fleet. How does this deep, often traumatic history fundamentally influence the current lack of trust and the maximalist demands we've discussed?
Oh, this deep-seated history is absolutely crucial because it explains why compromise on certain issues feels so existential. Russia's historical view of Ukrainians as Little Russians and its long-standing efforts at Russification, coupled with traumatic events like the Holodomor famine, well, they've fostered a profound, almost inherited mistrust within Ukraine. Disputes over Crimea and the Black Sea Fleet post-1991 merely reinforced pre-existing grievances. This isn't just a conflict about recent events, it's centuries of intertwined, often conflicted identity and power. This legacy means that current negotiation points aren't seen as isolated political calculations, but as continuations of a struggle for national identity and sovereignty for Ukraine, making compromise on territorial integrity or NATO membership not just a political concession, but a deeply emotional and historical betrayal. And for Russia, its security demands are also rooted in historical perceptions of its sphere of influence and protection from perceived Western encroachment. It's layered.
This deep dive has really shown us just how many layers there are to the quest for peace in Ukraine. From the initial, quickly derailed talks to the complex, multi-party proposals of today. The road is clearly not linear, and it's paved with deep-seated mistrust and clashing, often non-negotiable demands from both sides.
It's clear that while the military dimension of this conflict is often in the spotlight, understanding the intricate, often frustrating history of peace negotiations is crucial for grasping the true challenges ahead. The shifting positions based on battlefield realities, the attempts at external mediation by various global players, and the evolving public sentiment within Ukraine and Russia, they all paint a picture of an incredibly difficult path forward, where trust is minimal and fundamental values are consistently at stake.
Okay, a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to mull over. If both sides ultimately desire an end to the bloodshed, but neither is truly willing to compromise on their core demands,